My name is Claire, and I'm supposed to be dead. At 55, I never imagined I'd be saying those words. But here I am, breathing, thinking, feeling, while somewhere in a government database, my life officially ended 3 months ago. The strangest part? My own son is the one who killed me on paper. I've always been the type of woman who believed in family above all else. Raised in a small town where neighbors looked after each other and children respected their elders, I carried those values through decades of minimum wage jobs, scraped together savings, and the quiet dignity of someone who never asked for more than she earned. Every dollar I saved, every sacrifice I made, was for Daniel, my only child, my greatest pride. The respiratory illness crept up on me slowly at first, like fog rolling in from the ocean. What started as occasional shortness of breath during my shifts at the textile factory became a persistent cough that wouldn't leave. By the time the doctors gave it a name, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, my lungs had already surrendered most of their strength to years of industrial air and a few too many cigarettes in my younger days. "You'll need oxygen support, Doctor," Martinez explained gently, his kind eyes reflecting the compassion I'd grown accustomed to from medical professionals who'd seen this story too many times before. "And you can't live alone anymore, Claire. The equipment, the monitoring, you need someone reliable nearby." Daniel didn't hesitate when I called him. "Of course, Mom," he said, his voice warm with what I believed was genuine concern. "Pack whatever you need. You're coming home with me. Home." The word felt like a promise wrapped in love. After 37 years of independent living, of making my own decisions and paying my own way, the idea of depending on someone felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. But this was Daniel, the little boy I'd rocked to sleep through countless nights, the teenager I'd worked double shifts to keep in decent clothes, the young man I'd helped through college even when it meant eating beans and rice for weeks at a time. If you're enjoying this story and can relate to the struggles of family and trust, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to us. Also, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. It helps us understand our community better. Moving into Daniel's suburban house felt like stepping into a life I'd only imagined during my poorest moments. Clean carpets, modern appliances, a guest bedroom with its own bathroom, luxuries I'd never been able to afford on factory wages and part-time cleaning jobs. The oxygen concentrator hummed quietly in the corner, a constant reminder of my new limitations, but also proof that my son was willing to accommodate my needs. "Make yourself comfortable, Mom," Daniel said, helping me arrange my few belongings in the spacious dresser. "This is your home now, too." His wife, Sandra, smiled politely from the doorway, though something in her expression suggested this arrangement had been discussed in terms I wasn't privy to. She was 15 years younger than Daniel, blonde and perfectly groomed in the way that suggested comfortable living and regular salon appointments. We'd never been particularly close, different generations, different interests, but I'd always assumed that was normal for in-law relationships. "We've set up your oxygen equipment," Sandra said, gesturing toward the concentrator with the careful politeness reserved for unwelcome but temporary guests. "Daniel researched the best models. It should meet all your needs." The machine itself was more sophisticated than anything I'd owned in my entire life, with digital displays and programmable settings that Daniel patiently explained during my first week in their home. He'd become surprisingly knowledgeable about respiratory care, armed with printouts from medical websites and recommendations from online support groups. "You just need to focus on getting better," he assured me, adjusting the flow rate with practiced confidence. "Let me handle everything else." And I did let him handle everything. The insurance paperwork that arrived in thick manila envelopes, the disability applications that required signatures I could barely manage between breathing treatments, the pension fund communications that seemed increasingly complex and official. Daniel had always been good with numbers. He worked in accounting for a mid-sized insurance company, and I trusted his expertise in navigating bureaucratic systems that felt designed to confuse and discourage people like me. "Don't worry about the details, Mom," he'd say whenever I asked about forms he was completing on my behalf. "I've got power of attorney now. Everything's being handled properly." Power of attorney. The phrase had sounded so responsible when he'd first mentioned it, so mature and caring. Of course, my son should have legal authority to make decisions when my health made complex paperwork challenging. Of course, he should be able to communicate with insurance companies and pension administrators on my behalf. What loving child wouldn't want to protect their aging parent from bureaucratic stress? For the first few weeks, life in Daniel's house felt like the recovery period I'd been promised. I slept in a real bed with clean sheets changed regularly by Sandra. 8 meals prepared in a kitchen stocked with food I hadn't had to budget for, and spent my days reading library books while the oxygen concentrator provided the steady breath support my damaged lungs required. But gradually, I began to notice things. Small things at first. Whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Mail addressed to me that Daniel collected before I could see it. Phone calls taken in his home office with the door carefully closed. When I asked about these details, his explanations were always reasonable, always delivered with the patient tone reserved for elderly relatives who couldn't be expected to understand complex adult responsibilities. Insurance stuff, Mom. Nothing you need to worry about. Just some pension paperwork. I'm handling it. Sandra and I were discussing household schedules. Boring stuff. The isolation crept in slowly, like water seeping through invisible cracks in a foundation. My old friends from work didn't have my new phone number, and Daniel assured me he'd let everyone know about my move when I was feeling stronger. The neighbors seemed pleasant, but distant, offering polite waves but no invitations for coffee or conversation. Even my few remaining relatives apparently hadn't been informed of my change in address. At least, none of them called or visited during those first months. You need to focus on your health right now, Daniel reminded me whenever I mentioned feeling disconnected from my old life. Once you're stronger, we'll work on rebuilding your social connections. But for now, rest is the most important thing. Rest. The word began to feel less like medical advice and more like a gentle prison. I rested while Daniel managed my finances. Rested while Sandra made household decisions that affected my daily routine. Rested while the world continued around me in ways I couldn't see or influence. The oxygen tank beside my bed became more than medical equipment. It became a symbol of my dependence, a physical reminder that I could no longer survive independently. Every breath I took was filtered through machinery that Daniel had researched, purchased, and maintained. Even the air I breathed required his approval and assistance. Late at night, when the house was quiet except for the concentrator's steady hum, I sometimes wondered if this was what aging was supposed to feel like, this gradual disappearance from your own life, this slow transformation from participant to dependent. But something deep inside me, some stubborn ember of the woman who'd worked 2 jobs to raise a son alone, whispered that this wasn't right. I just didn't know yet how wrong it really was. Tomorrow, I would discover that my trust had been more dangerous than my illness. The first crack in my perfect illusion came on a Tuesday morning, hidden in a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd been living with Daniel and Sandra for 2 months when my breathing took a turn for the worse. The oxygen concentrator that had seemed like salvation now felt barely adequate, and even simple tasks like walking to the bathroom left me gasping. Dr. Martinez had scheduled an appointment to adjust my treatment plan, but Daniel insisted on handling all communication with my medical team. "You don't need the stress of dealing with doctors right now, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of patient authority I'd grown accustomed to. "I'll take care of everything." That morning, I woke earlier than usual, my lungs struggling against the humid air that always made my condition worse. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of Daniel preparing for work, coffee brewing, shower running, the muted conversation of morning news drifting from the kitchen television. I needed to use the bathroom, but the oxygen tube wasn't long enough to reach from my bedroom. Moving the portable concentrator would wake Sandra, and I'd learned that disturbing her sleep led to subtle but unmistakable irritation that would color the entire day. So I disconnected myself for the brief walk, holding my breath as much as possible, and moving as quietly as my compromised lungs would allow. That's when I heard Daniel's voice drifting from his home office, speaking in the crisp, professional tone he used for business calls. I paused outside his partially open door, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to avoid overhearing words that made my blood freeze in my veins. Yes, that's correct. Claire Morrison, deceased as of March 15th. The death certificate should be in your system by now. Deceased. The word hit me like a physical blow, knocking what little breath I had from my lungs. I pressed my hand against the wall, certain I'd misheard, that my oxygen-starved brain was playing tricks on me. But Daniel continued speaking with the casual efficiency of someone discussing routine paperwork. No funeral services were held. It was her wish for a simple cremation. Very private family matter, you understand. My legs felt weak beneath me. Not from lack of oxygen, but from the devastating realization that my own son was discussing my death as if it were a completed transaction. I leaned closer to the door, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid he might hear it. The pension benefits should transfer according to the beneficiary designation on file. I have the necessary documentation if you need to verify anything. Beneficiary. Transfer. Documentation. The clinical language couldn't disguise what I was hearing. Daniel was systematically claiming my death benefits while I stood breathing in his hallway, dependent on his charity and completely unaware of my own legal non-existence. I stumbled back to my room, my mind reeling with questions that had no acceptable answers. How long had he been planning this? What other aspects of my life had been manipulated or eliminated without my knowledge? Most devastatingly, how could the child I'd sacrificed everything to raise look at me every day while maintaining such an elaborate deception? The rest of that morning passed in a haze of forced normalcy that felt like performing in a play where I was the only actor who didn't know the script. Daniel kissed my forehead before leaving for work, the same gentle gesture he'd performed every day since I'd moved in, but now it felt like a mockery of the affection I'd believed was genuine. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine with what appeared to be sincere concern. "You look a little pale." I managed to mumble something about not sleeping well, all the while staring at this man who could inquire about my health while simultaneously profiting from my supposed death. The disconnect was so profound it felt surreal, like discovering that gravity had been reversed while everyone else continued walking normally on the ceiling. Sandra's behavior began to make more sense in this new context. Her polite distance, her reluctance to include me in household decisions, her way of discussing future plans as if my presence was temporary. She'd known. Of course she'd known. A wife doesn't remain ignorant when her husband is committing fraud serious enough to involve forged death certificates and stolen pension benefits. "Daniel mentioned you might be feeling worse lately," Sandra said during lunch, her tone carrying the sympathetic concern of someone discussing a terminal patient. "Maybe we should talk about making you more comfortable. You know, adjusting expectations about recovery. Adjusting expectations. Making me more comfortable." The euphemisms people used when they thought someone was dying, or when they needed them to die on schedule. I began paying closer attention to conversations, to the way Daniel and Sandra interacted when they thought I was napping or too medicated to follow complex discussions. References to "when this is over" and "once we're past this difficult period" took on sinister new meanings. The guest room that had initially felt like a welcome refuge now seemed more like a hospice setting, a place where an inconvenient elderly woman could be kept comfortable while legal processes ran their course. The isolation I'd attributed to my illness and relocation now revealed itself as something more deliberate. Daniel had indeed contacted my former colleagues and distant relatives, but not to give them my new address. Instead, he'd informed them of my declining health and eventual death, accepting their condolences and their promises to remember me fondly. My entire support network had been systematically severed through carefully crafted lies that painted Daniel as a grieving son dealing with loss in his own private way. "A few people from your old job called," he mentioned one evening, his expression appropriately solemn. "I told them you'd passed peacefully. They wanted you to know how much you meant to them." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only was he stealing my identity and my money, but he was also stealing my relationships, my chance to say goodbye to people who'd cared about me, my opportunity to be remembered as I actually was, rather than as whatever version of me served his purposes. Even worse was the realization of how completely I'd enabled my own erasure. Every form I'd signed without reading carefully, every power of attorney document I'd trusted him to handle properly, every decision I delegated because I was too tired or too sick to manage complex paperwork. All of it had been used to construct the legal framework for my disappearance. The pension I'd earned through 37 years of factory work, the small Social Security benefits I'd looked forward to as a foundation for basic security, the modest savings account I'd built through decades of careful budgeting, all of it was being transferred to Daniel as my sole heir and beneficiary. My life's work was financing his comfortable suburban lifestyle while I remained dependent on his charity for basic survival. But perhaps the most devastating aspect was the performance of care he maintained even after I'd discovered his deception. He continued bringing me prescribed medications, continued adjusting my oxygen equipment, continued asking about my comfort and well-being. The concern appeared genuine, which made it all the more disturbing. How could someone simultaneously care for your physical needs while systematically destroying your legal existence? That night, I lay in the guest bed that had become my world, listening to the concentrator's steady rhythm while processing the magnitude of my situation. I was legally dead, but physically dependent on the people who'd killed me on paper. I had no money, no official identity, no way to prove I existed to authorities who would undoubtedly assume I was confused or delusional. The oxygen mask over my face felt less like medical assistance and more like a symbol of my complete vulnerability. Every breath I took was controlled by equipment purchased with money stolen from my own accounts, maintained by a son who needed me alive enough to avoid awkward questions, but dead enough to access my benefits. I was trapped in the most sophisticated prison imaginable, one where my jailers provided medical care and home-cooked meals, while slowly erasing every trace of my existence from the world outside their house. But even in my weakest moment, something inside me refused to accept that this was how my story would end. The hardest part wasn't discovering I was supposed to be dead. It was pretending to be alive while everyone around me acted like I was already gone. In the days following my devastating discovery, I became a ghost, haunting my own existence. Every morning, I woke up legally deceased but physically present, forced to navigate conversations with people who knew the truth but continued the charade with Oscar-worthy performances of care and concern. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel would say, bringing me breakfast on the tray Sandra had designated for my meals. Meals for someone who wasn't supposed to exist. "How did you sleep? How do you sleep when you've discovered your own child has erased you from the world? How do you swallow food purchased with money stolen from your own pension? How do you respond to inquiries about your health from someone who's already filed your death certificate?" I tried. God help me. I tried to find reasonable explanations. Maybe I'd misunderstood the phone conversation. Maybe Daniel was handling some complex insurance matter that only sounded sinister to my oxygen-deprived brain. Maybe my deteriorating health was making me paranoid, suspicious of the very people who were sacrificing to care for me. But the evidence kept accumulating like snow in a blizzard, impossible to ignore or explain away. The mail that had once arrived addressed to Claire Morrison simply stopped coming. When I asked Daniel about it, he explained with patient kindness that he'd arranged for mail forwarding to avoid bothering me with unnecessary paperwork and bills. "You don't need that stress right now, Mom. I'm handling everything." Handling everything. The phrase had become his mantra, his explanation for every aspect of my disappearing autonomy. He was handling my medical appointments, my insurance claims, my pension communications, my tax obligations, handling them by systematically transferring everything from a living woman to a dead one's beneficiary. I started paying attention to Sandra's phone calls with her friends, conversations that drifted through the house while she assumed I was napping or too medicated to follow along. The careful way she discussed Daniel's situation at home and this difficult transition period painted a picture of a couple dealing with end-of-life care rather than providing temporary assistance to a recovering relative. "It's been so hard on Daniel," I heard her tell someone one afternoon while I sat in the living room, supposedly watching television, but actually eavesdropping with desperate intensity. "His mother's been declining so rapidly. We knew this day would come, but it's still devastating when you lose someone who meant so much to the family. Losing someone meant so much. Past tense, all of it, spoken about a woman who was sitting 20 feet away breathing through an oxygen cannula, but otherwise very much alive and increasingly aware of her own planned obsolescence. The most crushing realization was how easily I'd been disappeared from my own life. Daniel had contacted my former supervisor at the textile factory, expressing gratitude for the sympathy card and flowers that had apparently been sent to acknowledge my passing. He'd spoken with my landlord about cleaning out my old apartment, donating my belongings to charity as befitted someone who'd died with minimal assets and no specific wishes for her possessions. My entire adult life, 37 years of careful accumulation, modest treasures, practical necessities, had been reduced to donations and disposal without my knowledge or consent. The quilt my mother had made for my wedding, the photographs documenting decades of modest but meaningful experiences, the books I'd planned to reread in retirement, all gone, distributed to strangers or thrown away by people who saw them as the worthless remnants of a concluded life. We kept a few things we thought had sentimental value, Sandra mentioned during one of her increasingly rare attempts at conversation. Some photographs, a piece of jewelry. Daniel wanted to make sure we preserved memories of you, of his mother, memories of me. She was discussing preserving my memory while I sat across from her, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of forming new memories if anyone bothered to include me in experiences worth remembering. The psychological violence of it was more devastating than any physical abuse could have been. I tried to reach out to the outside world, to prove my continued existence to someone who might help me reclaim my identity. But every avenue revealed new aspects of my systematic erasure. The telephone in the guest room was connected, but when I attempted to call my old doctor's office, I discovered that my patient records had been closed due to my death. The receptionist offered condolences to whoever was calling on behalf of the deceased Claire Morrison, and when I tried to explain that I was Claire Morrison, very much alive and in need of medical care, her tone shifted to the careful politeness reserved for confused or delusional callers. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to speak with a family member or caregiver about this matter. Our records show that Ms. Morrison passed away several months ago. My bank account, the modest checking account where I'd deposited paychecks for decades, had been closed and its contents transferred to Daniel as next of kin. When I called to inquire about accessing my own money, the customer service representative explained with professional sympathy that accounts belonging to deceased customers could only be discussed with properly designated beneficiaries or estate administrators. If you're calling on behalf of the Morrison estate, I'll need to verify your authority to access this information. Estate. They were discussing my estate while I sat in a borrowed bedroom, wearing donated pajamas, eating food purchased with my own stolen pension benefits. The bureaucratic efficiency with which I'd been eliminated was both impressive and terrifying. Even more devastating was the discovery of my obituary. Daniel had written it himself, posting it in the local newspaper where my former colleagues might see it, and online where distant relatives might stumble across it while searching for old friends. The language was appropriately respectful, mentioning my years of dedicated service at the textile factory, and my pride in raising a successful son as a single mother. Claire Morrison, 55, passed away peacefully at home after a courageous battle with respiratory illness. She was preceded in death by her parents and is survived by her devoted son, Daniel, and daughter-in-law, Sandra. Claire will be remembered for her strong work ethic, her generous spirit, and her unwavering dedication to family. Reading my own obituary was a surreal experience that went beyond emotional trauma into the realm of existential crisis. Someone had summarized my entire life in fewer than 100 words, reducing 5.5 decades of experience, struggle, growth, and love into a paragraph that strangers would scan briefly before moving on to other news. But what hurt most was how accurate it was, how perfectly it captured the woman I'd been, devoted to work, proud of my son, generous even when I couldn't afford generosity. Daniel knew me well enough to write an obituary that my former colleagues would read and recognize as authentic. He understood my values, my priorities, my simple hopes for how I'd be remembered. He knew me intimately enough to kill me convincingly. The comment section below the online obituary filled with condolences from people I'd worked with for years, neighbors who'd shared small kindnesses over decades of living in the same community, distant relatives who remembered me fondly from family gatherings and holiday celebrations. Claire was such a dedicated worker and wonderful mother. I'll always remember her kindness and her beautiful smile. Daniel, please know that your mother made a difference in many lives. They were mourning me while I sat in my son's house, reading their grief and gratitude, watching myself be transformed from a complicated, living human being into a simplified, saintly memory. The version of Claire Morrison they were celebrating had never existed. She was too perfect, too uncomplicated, too peacefully resolved. But the real Claire Morrison, with her fears and flaws and desperate desire to survive this betrayal, had effectively ceased to exist in any way that mattered to the world outside Daniel's front door. That evening, as Sandra prepared what she called comfort food, with the solicitous care of someone feeding a terminal patient, I finally attempted the most direct approach to reclaiming my existence. "I know what you've done," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the concentrator's hum. "I know about the death certificate. I know about the pension. I know about everything." Sandra's stirring motion stopped mid-circle. For just a moment, her carefully maintained expression of concern flickered into something harder, more calculating. Then she set down her spoon and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "Oh, Claire," she said, her voice heavy with patronizing sympathy. "I know this is confusing. The medications can sometimes cause disorientation, hallucinations. Daniel mentioned that Dr. Martinez warned this might happen as your condition progresses. Hallucinations, disorientation, medication side effects. My reality was being reframed as symptoms of declining mental capacity, my accurate perceptions dismissed as the confused ramblings of a dying woman whose brain was no longer processing information correctly. "I'm not confused," I insisted, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "I heard Daniel on the phone. I know what he told the insurance company." "You know," Sandra continued, sitting down beside me with the gentle authority of a nurse calming an agitated patient, "maybe we should talk to Daniel about adjusting your pain medication. If you're experiencing distressing thoughts or strange beliefs, there are ways to make you more comfortable." More comfortable. The euphemism had become a threat. Comfort meant sedation, meant being medicated into compliance, meant losing even the minimal awareness that allowed me to understand what was being done to me. I was disappearing one dose at a time, one forged document at a time, one sympathetic lie at a time, but something deep in my chest, deeper than my damaged lungs, stronger than my weakening body, still burned with the stubborn fury of someone who refused to die on schedule. There comes a moment in every betrayal when you stop fighting the truth and start drowning in it. After my confrontation with Sandra, everything changed. Not dramatically. Daniel and Sandra were too smart for obvious cruelty. Instead, the changes came in small doses, like poison administered by someone who understood that sudden death raises questions, while gradual decline seems natural. My morning medications increased. "Doctor, Martinez adjusted your prescriptions," Daniel explained, holding out pills I'd never seen before alongside my usual respiratory treatments. "He thinks these will help with your anxiety and confusion. You've been having some troubling episodes lately." Troubling episodes. That's what they called my accurate perception of reality. The pills made everything fuzzy around the edges. My thoughts moved like thick syrup, and conversations felt like they were happening underwater. But worst of all, I stopped caring as much about the injustice of my situation. The sharp edges of my anger softened into dull resignation, and the burning need to expose their deception faded into something that felt almost like acceptance. "You seem more peaceful now," Sandra observed one afternoon, adjusting my blanket with the tender care of someone tending a beloved pet. "More settled. Settled. Like sediment sinking to the bottom of still water." The isolation became absolute during this period. Daniel installed new locks on doors I'd previously been able to access, explaining that it was for my safety since the medications made me unsteady. The phone in my room developed connectivity issues that somehow only affected outgoing calls. My requests to visit the public library for fresh air and mental stimulation were met with concerned explanations about my weakening immune system and the dangers of exposure to public spaces. "The doctor says your condition is progressing more rapidly than expected," Daniel told me one evening, his expression appropriately grave. "We need to focus on keeping you comfortable rather than maintaining false hopes about improvement." False hopes. Another way of saying I should stop expecting to survive this. But the most devastating blow came when I discovered they'd already held my memorial service. Sandra mentioned it casually while organizing my medications, apparently forgetting that the guest of honor was supposed to be unaware of her own funeral arrangements. "The flowers from your old coworkers were beautiful," she said, counting pills into my weekly dispenser. "Daniel gave such a moving eulogy. Everyone said it perfectly captured who you were, who I were, past tense." Even in her slip of the tongue, Sandra was more honest about my status than Daniel had ever been. I learned that they'd chosen a closed casket service, explaining to attendees that my final wishes had been for privacy and that my illness had changed my appearance in ways that would distress people who'd known me in better health. Dozens of people who'd cared about me had gathered to share memories and offer comfort to my grieving son, never knowing that the woman they mourned was sitting in a guest bedroom 12 miles away, slowly being medicated into compliance with her own erasure. Daniel had displayed photographs from throughout my life, my high school graduation, my wedding day, pictures of him as a baby that I'd treasured for 30 years. He'd accepted sympathy cards and casseroles, had shaken hands with former colleagues who expressed admiration for the way I'd raised such a devoted son. He'd played the role of bereaved child so convincingly that no one questioned the absence of my body or wondered why they'd never been invited to visit during my final illness. The guest book from my memorial service became Sandra's most cruel weapon. She brought it to my room one afternoon, presenting it with the solemn reverence reserved for sacred objects. "We thought you might like to see how much you meant to people," she said, opening the book to reveal page after page of handwritten messages from friends, colleagues, and acquaintances who'd taken time to honor my memory. Reading messages of condolence intended for my own funeral was an experience that transcended ordinary grief. These weren't just expressions of sympathy. They were final communications from people who believed they'd never have another chance to tell me what I'd meant to them. Claire always had a smile for everyone, even on her worst days. I'll never forget how she helped me when my husband was in the hospital. She worked harder than anyone and never complained. A true example of dignity and strength. "Daniel, your mother raised you right. She'd be so proud of the man you've become." That last comment, written by my former supervisor at the textile factory, hit me like a physical blow. She'd be so proud. As if pride were something I could no longer feel. As if my opinions about Daniel's character had become irrelevant, because death had supposedly ended my capacity for judgment. But the most devastating entry came from Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor from my old apartment building. In shaky handwriting that spoke of arthritic hands and failing eyesight, she'd written, "Claire was the daughter I never had. She checked on me every day and never let me feel alone. I don't know how I'll manage without her kindness." Mrs. Henderson had depended on me for small daily assistance, picking up prescriptions, bringing groceries, providing the human contact that kept isolation from becoming despair. Now she was alone, believing that her most reliable source of support had died and left her to navigate old age without backup. How many meals had she skipped because she assumed no one cared whether she ate? How many times had she felt sick or scared with no one to call because the person she'd trusted most was supposedly buried in a cemetery she'd never be able to afford to visit? I was failing people who needed me, not because of my illness or my weakness, but because my own son had convinced the world I was unavailable to help anyone ever again. The ripple effects of his deception extended far beyond stolen pension benefits into the realm of abandoned relationships and broken support systems. That night, staring at the ceiling while the concentrator provided its mechanical rhythm of artificial breath, I felt something inside me finally break. Not my spirit. That remained stubbornly intact despite everything they'd done to crush it. What broke was my faith in the fundamental order of the world, my belief that love and sacrifice created bonds that couldn't be severed by greed or convenience. I'd raised Daniel to be better than this. I'd worked double shifts to keep him in decent clothes, had gone without so he could have school supplies and birthday parties and the kind of childhood that would make him feel valued and secure. I'd taught him about honesty, about treating people with respect, about the importance of family loyalty that endured through difficult circumstances. Every lesson I'd tried to instill, every value I'd hoped to pass down, every sacrifice I'd made to ensure he grew up with a strong moral foundation, all of it had been discarded in favor of a scheme so calculating and cold that it required him to look into my eyes every day while maintaining the fiction of care and concern. The woman who'd raised him was dying in his guest bedroom, not from respiratory illness, but from the systematic destruction of everything that made existence bearable. And the man she'd raised was the one administering the treatment. But even in that darkest moment, when hope felt like a luxury I could no longer afford, something deep inside me refused to surrender completely. Maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Henderson's handwriting, shaky but determined to honor someone who'd cared about her daily welfare. Maybe it was the stubborn pride that had carried me through 37 years of factory work and single parenthood. Maybe it was just the biological imperative that keeps hearts beating even when the mind wants to quit. Whatever it was, it whispered one persistent thought through the medication-induced fog. This isn't how your story ends. Not like this. Not yet. The morning I decided to stop taking their pills was the morning I decided to stop dying on their schedule. It started with something small, a glimpse of sunlight through my bedroom window that reminded me of mornings at the textile factory when I'd arrive early and unlock the doors, breathing in the possibility of a new day despite the repetitive work ahead. That same light was falling across my face as I pretended to swallow the pills Daniel handed me with his daily performance of concerned care. "Make sure you get these down completely, Mom," he said, watching as I lifted the water glass to my lips. "Dr. Martinez says consistency is crucial for managing your anxiety." Anxiety. Their word for my accurate perception of reality. Instead of swallowing, I held the pills under my tongue until Daniel left the room, then spit them into a tissue I kept hidden beneath my pillow. It was a small act of defiance, but it felt like reclaiming something essential. My right to think clearly, to remember accurately, to experience my own emotions without chemical interference. Within days, the fog began to lift. The anger returned first, sharp and clean and focused in ways the medication had prevented. Then came the clarity that allowed me to see my situation not as an inevitable tragedy, but as a problem requiring strategy and patience to solve. I started watching Daniel and Sandra differently, not as my caretakers, but as my captors, who'd made one crucial mistake. They believed their own performance. They'd become so invested in the fiction of my declining mental state that they'd stopped being cautious about what they said and did within my hearing. "The life insurance payout should come through next month," Sandra mentioned to Daniel one evening, her voice carrying from the kitchen where she assumed I couldn't hear. "Once that's settled, we can start looking at bigger houses." Life insurance. Another financial benefit I'd apparently provided through my conveniently timed death. I wondered what other policies Daniel had taken out on my behalf, what other ways my demise would improve their standard of living. "We need to be careful about sudden lifestyle changes," Daniel replied, his tone carrying the caution of someone who understood that unexplained wealth raises questions. "Everything has to look natural, gradual. The kind of improvements you'd expect from a son who's been saving responsibly and received a modest inheritance. Modest inheritance. My entire life savings, my pension, my Social Security benefits, and apparently life insurance policies I'd never known existed, all reduced to Daniel's definition of modest. But their conversation revealed something more important than their greed. It revealed that they were still concerned about appearances, still worried about scrutiny from outside authorities, which meant they weren't invulnerable, weren't protected by some perfect crime that couldn't be exposed or prosecuted. I began to observe with the focused attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding her enemies. Daniel left for work at the same time every morning, following routines that spoke to his need for order and predictability. Sandra had bridge games on Tuesday afternoons and grocery shopping trips on Thursdays that left me alone in the house for several hours at a time. During those precious windows of unsupervised time, I began to explore areas of the house that had been subtly placed off limits through suggestions about my weakness and need for rest. Daniel's home office, where I'd first overheard the phone call about my death, contained filing cabinets that weren't locked, because who would suspect a dying woman of document theft? The evidence I found was more extensive than I'd imagined. Daniel had created an entire administrative system for managing my death, complete with copies of forged certificates, correspondence with insurance companies, and detailed records of benefit transfers and account closures. He'd been methodical, professional, treating my elimination like any other financial planning project. But he'd also been arrogant. The files contained copies of everything, including documents that proved the timing of various bureaucratic actions. The death certificate was dated 2 weeks before the phone call I'd overheard, which meant Daniel had been planning my demise while still bringing me breakfast and adjusting my oxygen equipment with apparent concern for my well-being. More damaging were the email communications he'd saved, probably for tax purposes, that documented his conversations with insurance representatives, pension administrators, and bank officers. These weren't just records of fraud, they were confessions, detailed admissions of exactly how he'd manipulated the system and exactly when he'd initiated each aspect of my legal death. I couldn't copy or steal these documents without risking discovery, but I could memorize key details: policy numbers, reference numbers, dates, the names of specific officials he'd communicated with, information that could be verified by investigators who had the authority to demand records and cross-reference claims. The most devastating discovery was a handwritten note in Daniel's careful script, tucked between insurance policies like a bookmark. It was a timeline, mapping out the progression of my supposed illness and death with clinical precision. Mom moves in, January. Establish medical dependence. Transfer power of attorney, February. Begin benefit transfers. File death certificate, March. Complete asset transfers, April. Memorial service, May. Full financial integration, June. I was reading my own murder schedule, planned months in advance with the efficiency of someone who'd researched the legal requirements and bureaucratic processes involved in inheriting from a deceased parent. The note even included contingency plans for what Daniel called management of difficult periods, which I now understood meant the increased medication whenever I showed signs of awareness or resistance. But at the bottom of the timeline, in the margin next to June, Daniel had written something that sent ice through my veins. Resolve remaining complications. Remaining complications. That's what I'd become in his carefully orchestrated plan. Not his mother, not a human being deserving of life and dignity, but a logistical problem requiring resolution. And given the context of everything else I'd discovered, resolution clearly didn't involve my continued survival. The timeline suggested I had weeks, maybe days, before Daniel decided that keeping me alive had become too risky or too expensive to justify. Whatever method he'd chosen for my final elimination, it would need to appear natural, consistent with my supposed terminal illness, something that would close the file permanently without raising questions about timing or cause. That night, lying in bed with my hidden collection of unswallowed pills growing beneath my pillow, I realized I had no choice but to become someone I'd never been before. Ruthless, strategic, and completely committed to my own survival, regardless of what it cost the people who'd betrayed me. The woman who'd raised Daniel with love and sacrifice was gone, killed by his greed as surely as if he'd used physical violence. The woman who remained had been forged by betrayal into something harder and more focused. I still loved the child he'd been, but I felt nothing but cold determination when I thought about the man he'd become. It wasn't revenge I wanted anymore. It was resurrection. I spent my dead days learning to live again, one carefully documented piece of evidence at a time. The first person who saw the real me in months was Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who lived across the street. I'd noticed her during my window observations, an elderly woman who maintained her garden with the dedication of someone who understood that small acts of creation were acts of resistance against entropy and despair. On a Thursday morning, when Sandra left for grocery shopping, I managed to disconnect my oxygen tank long enough to walk to the front door. Mrs. Patterson was pruning her rose bushes, and when she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted from polite neighborly acknowledgement to startled recognition. "My goodness," she said, setting down her pruning shears and walking toward the property line that separated our yards. "You must be Daniel's mother." I thought, well, I'd heard that you'd died. I finished for her, my voice rusty from weeks of whispering. "Yes, I heard that too." Mrs. Patterson's face went through several expressions: confusion, concern, and finally a kind of knowing wariness that suggested she'd lived long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. "Are you all right, dear? You look like you could use some help." Those simple words, "You look like you could use some help," nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. When was the last time someone had asked what I needed instead of telling me what was best for me? "I need someone to know I'm alive," I said, the truth spilling out before I could calculate the risks. "I need someone who isn't Daniel or Sandra to see me, to remember that I exist." Mrs. Patterson glanced toward Daniel's house, then back at my face with the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to read between lines. "Why don't you come over for tea this afternoon, when your son gets home from work? We'll sit by my front window where everyone can see us." Smart woman. She understood instinctively that visibility was protection, that witnesses were insurance against people who preferred to operate in shadows. That afternoon, tea became my lifeline to the outside world. Mrs. Patterson didn't ask intrusive questions, didn't demand explanations I couldn't safely provide. Instead, she treated me like a living person with opinions and preferences, offering me choices about everything from which chair I'd prefer to what kind of cookies I might enjoy. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she told me, pouring tea into china cups that had obviously been wedding gifts from another era. "People kept telling me what I needed, what would be best for me. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is just let them be who they are instead of who you think they should be." During that first visit, I mentioned casually that I'd been having trouble with my mail delivery, that important documents seemed to be getting lost. Mrs. Patterson offered to let me use her address for anything urgent, a suggestion that felt like being thrown a rope while drowning. "My mailbox is right there at the curb," she said, pointing to the blue metal box that sat only 50 yards from Daniel's front door. "If you need anything delivered where you can be sure to receive it personally, you just let me know." Over the following weeks, I established a routine. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when Sandra was reliably absent, I would visit Mrs. Patterson for tea and conversation. These visits served multiple purposes. They provided me with a witness to my continued existence. They gave me access to communication channels Daniel couldn't monitor, and they allowed me to begin documenting my situation with someone who could corroborate my story. Mrs. Patterson proved to be more than just a neighbor. She was a retired librarian with 40 years of experience helping people navigate complex information systems. When I explained that I needed to contact certain government offices but couldn't use my home phone, she offered to help me research the appropriate agencies and procedures. "You know," she said one afternoon, while we reviewed a list of phone numbers I'd copied from Daniel's files, "my late husband used to work for the Social Security Administration. He always said that the most important thing in any bureaucratic investigation was documentation. Dates, times, specific names of officials, reference numbers. The more detailed your records, the harder it becomes for people to dismiss your concerns." I began keeping a journal, hidden in the space between my mattress and box spring where Daniel and Sandra would never think to look. Every conversation I overheard, every suspicious phone call, every detail about my systematic erasure went into that notebook written in handwriting, deliberately made smaller and more careful than my usual script. March 8th. Daniel told insurance investigator I died peacefully in my sleep. Caller ID showed Mutual Benefits Corp. March 12th. Sandra mentioned to someone named Jennifer that the difficult transition period would be over soon. March 15th. Overheard Daniel scheduling appointment with a state attorney. Mentioned finalizing remaining transfers. But documentation was only the first step. I needed to establish communication with authorities who had the power to investigate my claims and verify my identity. Through Mrs. Patterson's research, I identified specific individuals at various agencies who specialized in fraud investigation. The Social Security Administration had a dedicated hotline for reporting identity theft and fraudulent benefit claims. The State Insurance Commission maintained a fraud investigation unit that handled cases involving forged death certificates and illegitimate life insurance payouts. Even the local police department had a financial crimes division that dealt with elder abuse and family exploitation cases. Making those initial contacts required careful planning. I couldn't call from Daniel's house, and I couldn't meet with investigators at an address where Daniel might discover my activities. Mrs. Patterson suggested using her home as a mailing address and meeting location, presenting herself as a concerned neighbor who'd noticed irregularities in what appeared to be a case of elder fraud. The first response came from Maria Gonzalez, a social worker with the state's Adult Protective Services Division. Her letter, delivered to Mrs. Patterson's mailbox, was professionally cautious but indicated genuine interest in investigating my situation. Based on your initial report, she wrote, this case exhibits several characteristics consistent with financial elder abuse. If the alleged victim is indeed alive and capable of communicating independently, we would like to schedule a confidential interview to document her concerns and assess her safety. A confidential interview. Official documentation of my concerns. Assessment of my safety. For the first time in months, I felt the possibility that someone with actual authority might take my situation seriously. But the letter also contained a warning that made my blood run cold. Please be aware that cases involving forged death certificates and identity fraud often escalate when perpetrators believe their crimes are at risk of exposure. If you have reason to believe the alleged victim is in immediate danger, contact emergency services immediately. Immediate danger. The phrase echoed through my mind as I remembered Daniel's timeline and his note about resolving remaining complications. How much time did I have before my continued existence became too risky for him to tolerate? That evening, I watched Daniel during dinner with new eyes. He seemed more tense than usual, checking his phone frequently and responding to messages with the kind of focused attention that suggested important communications. When Sandra asked about his day, his answers were vague, distracted. Just wrapping up some long-term projects, he said, not meeting her eyes. Things that have been dragging on longer than expected. Long-term projects. I wondered if I was the project he was referring to, if my stubborn survival had become an inconvenience that required more decisive action. After dinner, he made a phone call from his office that I managed to overhear by positioning myself in the hallway outside his door. The conversation was brief, but chilling in its clinical precision. Yes, I think we're ready to move to the final phase, he said to whoever was on the other end. The situation has been stable, but we can't let it drag on indefinitely. Too many variables, too many opportunities for complications. Final phase. Variables. Complications. I was listening to my son discuss my murder with the same detached professionalism he might use to describe quarterly financial projections. But this time, I wasn't just a victim waiting for his decision. I was a woman with evidence, allies, and a plan of my own. The morning I rose from the dead started like any other day of pretending to die. Daniel brought my breakfast tray at 8:15, same as always, his movements carrying the efficient care of someone maintaining a routine that had become second nature. The pills were arranged beside my orange juice in the small ceramic dish Sandra had designated for my medications, pills I would pretend to swallow, then hide beneath my pillow once he left. But something was different in his demeanor. There was a finality in the way he adjusted my blanket, a carefulness in how he avoided meeting my eyes directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle tone people use with terminal patients when they've given up hope for recovery. I've scheduled a meeting with hospice services for this afternoon, Mom, he said, smoothing the covers with unnecessary attention to detail. It's time we talked about making you more comfortable, about managing your pain in these final stages. Final stages. Hospice services. The euphemisms felt like death sentences delivered with compassionate efficiency. Dr. Martinez thinks it's the humane approach, Daniel continued, still not looking directly at me. No more struggling with treatments that aren't working, just peace, dignity, and freedom from suffering. Freedom from suffering. Freedom from breathing. Freedom from existing as an inconvenient complication in his carefully orchestrated financial plan. After he left for work, I lay still until I heard Sandra's car pull out of the driveway for her Thursday grocery run. Then I moved faster than I had in months, adrenaline overriding the weakness that had become my constant companion. I had maybe 3 hours before anyone returned, and I had calls to make that couldn't wait any longer. Mrs. Patterson met me at her back door, took one look at my face, and immediately invited me inside without questions or explanations. Her phone sat on a small table in her kitchen, and beside it was a notebook where she'd written down every number I might need, organized by priority and marked with the best times to reach specific individuals. The first call was to Maria Gonzalez at Adult Protective Services. When she answered, I identified myself as Claire Morrison and spoke words I'd rehearsed for weeks. I'm calling to report that I'm being held against my will by family members who have fraudulently declared me dead in order to steal my benefits." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of papers rustling. "Ma'am, I have a file here initiated by a neighbor reporting concerns about elder abuse. Are you the Claire Morrison who's supposed to have died in March?" "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm the woman whose funeral was held while she was still breathing, and I have evidence." Maria's voice shifted into professional efficiency mode. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to need you to stay exactly where you are. Do not return to your son's house. Do not contact him or his wife, and do not leave the location where you're calling from. I'm dispatching a team immediately, and we're going to document everything." The second call was to Detective Sarah Kim at the Financial Crimes Unit. She'd been expecting my call based on preliminary reports, and her response was swift and decisive. "Mrs. Morrison, we've been building a case based on the evidence your neighbor provided, but we needed to verify your identity and get your direct testimony. How soon can you meet with investigators?" "Right now," I said. "I have documentation, I have witness accounts, and I have very good reasons to believe my life is in immediate danger." The third call was the most satisfying, to Mutual Benefits Corporation, the life insurance company that had apparently paid out my death benefit. When I identified myself to the customer service representative, there was a long pause followed by frantic typing. "Ma'am, according to our records, Claire Morrison died in March. Are you calling on behalf of her estate?" "No," I said, savoring each word. "I'm calling because I'm Claire Morrison. I'm very much alive, and someone has been committing fraud using my identity. I believe you'll want to investigate this before you become accessories to a crime that's apparently cost your company a significant amount of money." By the time Sandra returned from grocery shopping, Mrs. Patterson's house had been transformed into a command center. Adult Protective Services had arrived first, followed by 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit, then a representative from the State Attorney General's office who specialized in insurance fraud. I sat in Mrs. Patterson's living room, surrounded by officials who treated me like a person whose story mattered, whose survival was important, whose rights had been violated in ways that demanded legal consequences. For the first time in months, I felt like more than a problem to be managed. I felt like a human being whose dignity deserved protection. Detective Kim spread photographs across Mrs. Patterson's coffee table, copies of my forged death certificate, bank records showing the transfer of my accounts, insurance documents authorizing benefit payments to Daniel as my beneficiary. Each piece of evidence represented another aspect of my systematic erasure, but now they were proof of crimes rather than successful deceptions. "Mrs. Morrison," Detective Kim said, looking at me with the respect reserved for credible witnesses rather than confused patients, "this is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of identity fraud and elder abuse we've seen. Your son didn't just steal your money, he created an entire false reality and maintained it for months while you were living in his house." The social worker from Adult Protective Services was documenting my physical condition, photographing the medication bottles I'd brought from Daniel's house, recording my testimony about the pills I'd been forced to take, and the isolation I'd endured. Every detail was being preserved as evidence of abuse, neglect, and systematic exploitation. But the most important moment came when Maria Gonzalez asked the question I'd been waiting months to hear. "Mrs. Morrison, what do you want to happen now? What would justice look like to you?" Justice. The word felt foreign after so long believing it was impossible. "I want my life back," I said. "I want my identity restored, my accounts reopened, my benefits returned. I want people to know that I survived this, that I'm not the victim they tried to make me." "And your son?" Detective Kim asked. "What consequences do you think are appropriate for someone who committed fraud of this magnitude?" I thought about Daniel as a little boy, about the sacrifices I'd made to raise him, about the love that had once felt unbreakable between us. Then I thought about his timeline, his plans for resolving remaining complications, his willingness to let me die rather than face consequences for his crimes. "I want him prosecuted to the full extent of the law," I said, my voice clear and certain. "He didn't just steal money, he stole my existence, my relationships, my dignity. He convinced people who cared about me that I was dead, that they'd lost me forever. That's not just fraud. It's cruelty on a scale that deserves serious consequences. At 4:30 that afternoon, I watched from Mrs. Patterson's front window as police cars surrounded Daniel's house. I saw him emerge in handcuffs, his face pale with shock as he realized his carefully constructed deception had collapsed completely. Sandra followed in a second car, crying and gesturing frantically as officers explained her rights and her charges. The neighbors who'd never known I existed came out of their houses to watch the drama unfold. Mrs. Patterson stood beside me, her hand resting supportively on my shoulder, as we observed the moment when Daniel's world fell apart with the same systematic precision he'd used to dismantle mine. "How does it feel?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly. "To watch someone discover that their victim refused to stay dead." I smiled, breathing freely for the first time in months. "It feels like resurrection." 6 months later, I was legally alive again, but more importantly, I was finally living. The courtroom was packed with people I'd thought had forgotten me, former co-workers from the textile factory, neighbors from my old apartment building, even Mrs. Henderson from across the hall who'd written that heartbreaking note in my memorial guest book. When word spread that Claire Morrison had risen from the dead to testify against her own son, the story captured attention in ways that went far beyond local news. Daniel sat at the defendant's table in a suit I'd probably helped pay for, his lawyer whispering urgent instructions while he stared at the floor. Sandra sat in the gallery behind him, her perfectly styled hair now showing gray roots, her designer clothes replaced with the practical attire of someone whose comfortable lifestyle had evaporated overnight. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in financial crimes, had built her case around the timeline I'd discovered in Daniel's office. Each document, each phone call, each transfer of funds was presented as evidence of a conspiracy so calculated and cruel that it shocked even experienced legal professionals. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said during opening arguments, "this isn't just a case about stolen money. This is about a son who looked his mother in the eye every morning while collecting benefits from her supposed death. This is about systematic psychological torture disguised as medical care." When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand without oxygen assistance for the first time in over a year. My respiratory condition had improved dramatically once I'd stopped taking Daniel's medications, and while I still needed treatment, I was no longer the dying woman he'd convinced everyone I'd become. "Mrs. Morrison," the prosecutor asked, "can you tell the court what it felt like to read your own obituary?" I looked directly at Daniel as I answered. "It felt like watching someone bury a version of me that had never existed. Too perfect, too peaceful, too grateful for a son who'd never given me reason to be grateful for anything." The defense tried to paint me as a confused elderly woman, suggesting that my respiratory illness had affected my mental capacity, and that Daniel had been acting out of genuine concern for my welfare. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too well documented, too clearly premeditated to support their narrative. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered verdicts on 12 separate charges: identity fraud, insurance fraud, elder abuse, financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy. Guilty on all counts. Daniel's sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen enough cases of family exploitation to feel personally offended by this one, delivered a statement that felt like vindication for every moment of helplessness I'd endured. "Mr. Morrison," she said, looking at Daniel with undisguised disgust, "you didn't just steal your mother's money. You stole her existence, her relationships, her dignity, and very nearly her life. You caused friends and neighbors to mourn someone who was still alive, still needing their support. The psychological cruelty of this crime is matched only by its calculated precision." She sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison, with requirements to pay full restitution plus penalties that would ensure he'd be starting over financially when he was eventually released. Sandra received 5 years and probation, her punishment reduced because she'd cooperated with investigators and testified about Daniel's planning and decision-making. But the legal victory was only the beginning of my real resurrection. Mrs. Henderson was the first person I called when my phone service was restored. She cried for 10 minutes straight when she heard my voice, then demanded I come over immediately for the dinner she'd been too depressed to cook for herself since my supposed death. "I've been eating nothing but crackers and soup," she sobbed into the phone. "I didn't see the point in real meals when the only person who cared whether I ate properly was gone." When I knocked on her door that evening, she looked at me like she was seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. We sat in her kitchen and shared a pot roast that tasted like celebration, like the simple joy of being alive and valued and remembered by someone whose life was better because you existed. My old supervisor from the textile factory offered me a job in their customer service department. Part-time, flexible hours, designed around my health needs, but recognizing that I wanted to contribute rather than just survive. After months of being treated like an expensive burden, the opportunity to be useful again felt like a gift. The insurance companies and pension administrators who'd been defrauded not only restored my benefits, but paid significant settlements for the emotional distress and lost income I'd suffered. Daniel's modest inheritance became the foundation for financial security I'd never had even during my working years. But the most meaningful restoration was harder to quantify. People started including me in their lives again, inviting me to neighborhood gatherings, asking my opinion on community issues, treating me like someone whose perspective and experience had value. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was participating. Mrs. Patterson and I became genuine friends, united by the experience of watching justice triumph over carefully orchestrated cruelty. She helped me find a small apartment near her house, close enough for daily tea, but independent enough to prove I could manage my own life again. "You know what I admire most about what you did?" she asked one afternoon while we sat in her garden, watching her roses bloom in the spring sunshine. "You didn't just survive betrayal. You transformed it into something that made you stronger." 6 months after Daniel's sentencing, I received a letter from the Adult Protective Services Division asking if I'd be willing to speak with other elderly abuse victims, to share my story as proof that even the most hopeless situations could be reversed with courage and proper support. I said yes, of course, because I'd learned that surviving betrayal isn't enough. You have to use that survival to help others who are still trapped in circumstances that seem impossible to escape. The first woman I counseled was named Dorothy, 73 years old, whose grandson had been stealing her Social Security checks while convincing her she was too confused to manage her own finances. She reminded me of myself in those dark months, believing she was helpless, accepting explanations that didn't make sense, gradually disappearing from her own life. "But how do you start fighting back when you're so weak?" she asked, her voice carrying the same despair I remembered feeling. "You start by refusing to take their pills," I told her, sharing the small act of rebellion that had begun my own resurrection. "You start by remembering that being sick doesn't mean being stupid, and being dependent doesn't mean being powerless." 3 months later, Dorothy called to tell me her grandson had been arrested and her benefits had been restored. "I kept thinking about what you said," she laughed through happy tears, "about refusing to die on someone else's schedule. Now, 2 years after my legal resurrection, I live in a sunny apartment filled with plants that need daily care and attention. I have friends who depend on me, work that provides purpose, and resources that allow me to help other people reclaim their lives from family members who've confused love with ownership. Sometimes I think about Daniel in prison, learning what it feels like to have someone else control every aspect of your daily existence. I don't wish him suffering, but I hope he's discovering that powerlessness teaches empathy in ways that privilege never can. I still need respiratory therapy, still move more slowly than I once did, still face the physical limitations that come with aging and illness. But I face them as myself, Claire Morrison, survivor, advocate, woman who refused to accept that betrayal was the final chapter of her story. The morning I decided to stop taking their pills was the morning I chose to live on my own terms. Everything that followed, the investigation, the trial, the restoration of my identity and dignity, began with that single moment of quiet rebellion. I learned that resurrection isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one refusal to surrender at a time. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to die when someone else has decided your time is up.